One of the most challenging lessons I've had to learn in my life is to accept what is, to go with the flow of life and to surrender. And for me, it's one of the most counterintuitive things that I have because I just want to fight sometimes. But what I've realized is when I let go and when I do surrender, that's generally when life takes me exactly where I need to be. Now, this takes discipline, it takes courage. And quite honestly, what I've come to realize is that acceptance and surrender are not for wimps. Hi, everyone. Chris NATZKE here with Black Belt Leadership Speaking and Coaching with your Mind of a Champion tip of the week. Acceptance and surrender are not for wimps. You know, in our society, we are taught to fight for what we want. We're taught to go against the obstacles and stop at no cost. In fact, in my own discipline of martial arts, one of the things we have is a Korean word. It's called pil sung, and it means certain victory. And quite honestly, I've had some great success in my life because I've just refused to give up. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is this idea of accepting what is in our lives, even if we want it to change at some point, but don't live in an aspect of constantly resisting against it because it takes up so much of our energy. So accepting what is and then surrendering our resistance to it. Now, when I talk about surrender, I'm not talking about giving in. I'm not talking about waving the white flag. I'm talking about giving up our resistance to it, as well as the limiting beliefs and the negative thoughts that continue to keep it alive in our lives, rather than accepting it and then taking positive action to make the change that we want. I've always loved the quote from author Byron Katie, and it goes something like this. She says, when I resist in life, I always lose, but only 100% of the time. Right? Who can relate to that? I know I can. So, what do we do when we find ourselves in a place where we are resisting and we're being called to accept and surrender to what is, but it's really difficult for us to do? Well, I've got 5 ideas for us to not only contemplate this week, but also take some inspired action in to see if this is what you can do to have the breakthroughs occur that you're meant to have. So the first one is this. When you find yourself in resistance, stop, drop, and breathe. Stop, drop, and breathe. Now, if you're old like me, you probably remember when we were growing up in school, they always talked about stop, drop, and roll if you ever caught on fire, right? So you stop, you assess what's going on, you drop to the ground, you roll to put out the fire. Well, in this, stop, drop, and breathe basically means stop. Stop your mind. Stop the rumination that's going on. Drop into your heart and then breathe from that place. Slow down so you can slow down the anxiety of your mind so you can make a clear assessment of what's your next step to take. Number 2 is remind yourself that things almost always work out for you. I mean, come on, let's get really honest here. I'm sure there are times in our lives where we've had difficulties, and unfortunately, some of us have experienced tragedies when things didn't work out for us. But most of the time, they do. And in fact, I think that what's so interesting is the times that they don't in our lives is what we remember. But the millions of times that they did work out, we tend to experience them and then we forget them. But think about this. In my keynote talks, I talk about this study called the Worry Cure. And I'm going to go through it all of it here, but the net is this, is of all the people that they analyzed in this study, 97% of the time, the things they worried about never happened, or if they did happen, they weren't as bad as they thought they'd be. 97% of the time. So I guess I'd ask you the question, how would you act if you knew this to be true? How would you approach life? What conversations would you have? What risks would you take? So just keep that in mind. Life almost always works out for us. In fact, I would argue it always does. It may not be that we want it to, but it's always working out for our highest good. Now, number 3 is to take some inspired action. When we find ourselves in resistance and we have mental anxiety about things, sometimes just getting in motion is what can relieve a lot of that stress. Now, I'm not saying you have to take massive action. Maybe it's just taking a small step and then being aware where the next right move is for you to take. But just getting ourselves in action, whether it's a step, a phone call, getting on the internet, exploring something, having a conversation with someone that we need to have, just taking that step begins to allow that resistance to begin to dissolve. Number 4 is, and this is an important one, ask for help when needed. So many of us think we have to take on lives by ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that every time you have a challenge, you're just pointing that off on somebody else. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I think that most of us, though, when we're going through difficulties, we tend to get quiet and we think that we're the only one in the world that's going through it, and we we resist asking for help. But when you really need it, when you've exhausted your options and you've tried it, there's nothing wrong with asking for help. In fact, one of my coaches years ago said that 100% strength comes from 100% vulnerability. And sometimes one of the most vulnerable things we can do is ask for help. And then finally, let go of the outcome. Let go of the outcome. I mean, that's so hard. I know it's difficult for me as well. I mean, we have goals, we have aspirations, but maybe sometimes the things that we're actually striving for are not exactly the way they're supposed to show up. When we went through the pandemic 5 years ago, one of my good friends said to me, he said, be stubborn in your goals, but be flexible in your methods. Be flexible in your methods. And we were called to do that back in the pandemic. So where do you have an opportunity to get intentional, to know what you want to have created, take the steps to make it happen, but then say, you know what, for this or something better to occur in my life. When you do that, you'll be blown away on the magical breakthroughs that you tend to experience. So this week, my friends, here's what I'd ask you, I might challenge you to do is those 5 points that I brought up, think about those as you're going through and you find yourself in resistance. And when you find yourself in that place, lean into it. Know that surrender is not about giving up, or about giving in. It's about giving up those limiting beliefs and that resistance. And when you do that, you're going to find the breakthroughs that you want are going to occur in your life. But also understand it's not always easy because acceptance and surrender is not for wimps. This has been Chris NATZKE with Black Belt Leadership Speaking and Coaching. We'll see you next time on the Mind of a Champion Tip of the Week.